As we enter the final chapter of our book, we learn about the laws of debitors and creditors relations and consumer protection. The book details the rights and remedies for creditors to collect the debt that is due to them. They can do that through various liens. They can also do that through garnishments. So my familiarity with garnishments comes from my work, and I have had employees previously who have had their pay garnished for various reasons. So basically, we were served with papers from the courts to garnish the wages of those particular employees. We then take the payment directly out of their pay, and it is sent in the form of a check to the designated party. In the case that I'm most familiar with at this point, it goes to a sheriff, and the sheriff then distributes that back to the creditors that are due that payment. There can be many things that lead up to that type of situation. Then, it's not something that the employee nor the employer can just say, no, we're not going to do that. It is a court-ordered situation, and until that particular debt is paid, the pay will continue to be garnished. In the state of Connecticut, I don't know if that's the same in Ohio, but you can also have wages garnished for various reasons, such as child support, that type of thing as well. The book also talks about mortgages and mortgage foreclosures. So that would be a situation where somebody has taken out a mortgage, say on a home, and have defaulted on that mortgage, and the bank is foreclosing on that loan. So the um, the individuals that have that home would then be without that home, I guess. That home would then be put up for sale or put up for auction, and the bank or agency that had held the mortgage would get the benefits from that sale. If there were benefits from that sale beyond what is owed, those would go back to the individual who had owned the home before it was foreclosed on. The chapter talks a lot about bankruptcies and the different types or chapters of bankruptcies. So chapter 7 would be a straight bankruptcy, that there's no attempt to kind of work things out or pay off the debt that is owed. It strictly goes just to bankruptcy. It also, the chapter details information on the chapter 13, which would be for somebody who is a wage earner, and a portion of those earnings can be paid to the courts for distribution among the creditors over a typically no more than 3-year period of time. That was one that I really wasn't familiar with. I have heard about chapter 7 before. And then, a lot of times you hear in the news that there are businesses that file for chapter 11. So basically that is typically a business's way of trying to reorganize and save their business from being completely bankrupt and thus going out of business. So chapter 11 gives them an opportunity to reorganize and try to save themselves. And then chapter 12 was one that I hadn't heard before, but that is in regards to family farmers and fishermen that have the right to file for bankruptcy um, under that code. And one of the things that I think about in bankruptcy situations is from the creditor's standpoint, and the fact that they may not gain back all of the monies that they have lost in these situations. So I don't really know. There really doesn't seem to be a repercussion for them, and I guess they're just supposed to be happy that they're getting something instead of nothing, but it just doesn't seem right. Um, my husband and I have always operated under the auspice that if we don't have the money or the cash for something, we don't buy it, with the exception of our home, which we had taken out a mortgage on. But it personally, it somewhat bothers me that there are people who get themselves into this kind of credit card debt, if you will, and then it's just supposed to be wiped away. It really just doesn't seem quite fair. They shouldn't have been putting themselves in that situation to begin with. So I kind of, the whole bankruptcy thing somewhat is concerning to me. I understand if people fall on hard times, but that still doesn't answer the issue on behalf of the creditor. And it's not always big companies or that kind of thing. It can be small companies as well that are not getting the worth for what they had put out. The chapter continues to talk about consumer laws and all of the protections for the consumer. And I think that in this day and age, there have been a number of situations. The book had talked about, say, the car industry, that there are lemon laws, and I actually remember when those kind of had started to come about, and for a period of time I did work in a car industry, and so I think that even today there is some difficulty sometimes in purchasing some, especially used vehicles. There are companies that are not willing to, auto dealerships that aren't willing to take a chance on a used vehicle by selling it, because they have to guarantee that vehicle. And so many of them are just sending them off to auction instead of trying to sell them. The book talks about, advertising and sort of what is fair and unfair. And I think part of that to me is what is ethical and not ethical. So what may be fair may not be ethical, and I think that as a business I would want to operate from an ethical standpoint. And finally, the chapter kind of closes talking about the Dodd-Frank Act and consumer protection. And it talks about the credit and debit cards and the interchange fees that are allowed, and what those provisions are. It discusses credit scores and how in residential mortgages that lenders are no longer allowed to pay mortgage brokers a commission based on the interest rate for a home loan. And then it also talks about the unfair and deceptive practices statutes, and that all states have statutes that forbid deceptive acts and practices in ways that were similar to the Section 5 of the FTCA. Um, and so I think that that is this every state's way of addressing the unfair practices and deception in, say, advertising, that type of thing. That all the states have taken a stand against that and in line with um, the FTCA Section 5. And as far as businesses are concerned, we've talked about how when businesses are involved internationally, it's very important for them to understand the rules and regulations in the particular countries that they are involved in, and consumer protection laws are no exception. What may be acceptable in one country or say acceptable in the US may not be acceptable in another country. And so while I think that the US probably has very good and high standards for consumer protection, there may be situations that something may be acceptable here, but it's not acceptable somewhere else. So it's very important to be sure that you know and are familiar with all aspects of laws and regulations when you are dealing with businesses in other countries, to be sure that you're following um, their rules and be sure that your consumer protection standards for your company are in line with the standards for that particular country.